Welcome to the very first Richardson Institute roundtable event of the academic year. Quiet please, professors at the back. Welcome. Nice to see so many people here. Such a full room is wonderful. And it's great to be able to kick off the academic year with a really timely, really interesting debate about incredibly important, much criticised, highly debated concept within international politics. That is the responsibility to protect. And I'm delighted that joining me on the panel today we have a number of colleagues from PPR, from law, and that will help us to hopefully engage in a really vibrant interdisciplinary discussion of a concept that is hugely important when we're trying to understand events across the modern world. We've seen in recent years the onset of a violent civil war in Syria, a huge, catastrophic humanitarian crisis in Syria that is leaving 22.8 million people in dire need of humanitarian assistance. And yet the world seems to sit back and do very little. It did very little to help with a Syrian conflict that has resulted in over 500,000 people being killed and over 11 million people being displaced from their homes. That's more than the population of London being displaced from their homes. And the world stands by and watches. Yet there is a mechanism within international politics, within international law, that is designed to try and prevent this type of catastrophe from happening. And that's what we'll be talking about today. So we'll kick off this discussion with Karolina Follis from PPR, then we'll move to James Sweeney from law, and then James Summers from law. And hopefully we'll speak for 5 minutes approximately each, and then we'll have a good amount of time for a Q&A towards the end. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Karolina. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon, and it's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you for inviting me. I want to say from the outset, I think apart from improving the gender makeup of the panel, you also invited me because of my interest in what can, what of a topic that intersects with the issue of humanitarian intervention, namely my interest in forced displacement, the consequences of forced displacement, and the responsibility of states to address the plight of refugees. So that's what I work on. And so my reflections on this topic are informed by this core area of my interest. And so in this opening, and we'll have a wide-ranging discussion here, but in the opening, I want to reflect on the responsibility part of responsibility to protect. So I'm going to so Simon mentioned the international mechanism, right? The status of this mechanism is widely debated too, but it rests on this foundational document, this report of the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty, and which developed responsibility to protect, and I'm just going to quote from the report, as the idea that sovereign states have a responsibility to protect their own citizens from avoidable catastrophe, from mass murder and rape, from starvation, but that when they are unwilling or unable to do so, that responsibility must be borne by the broader community of states, right? So that report, which came out in 2001, it tried to move the discussion around humanitarian intervention, right, from this idea of a right to intervene to this idea of responsibility to protect, right? And they also say the principle of non-intervention under responsibility to protect yields to this concern, right, that other states have to have for vulnerable populations. And so there are those who have been left unprotected by their own negligent, rogue, or otherwise unresponsive regimes, right? And so there's a responsibility. And so what is responsibility, right? What is responsibility in this context? At first glance, it might seem like something that's unequivocally positive, right? It invokes this idea of responsible adults in the room who cannot stand what they're seeing, who cannot stand by watching idly as disaster unfolds, as atrocities are being committed against innocent, vulnerable peoples. So, but what does it really mean when we get down to it? And if you look in the Oxford English Dictionary, you will notice that responsibility has a double meaning, right? It has two definitions. One of them is the capability of fulfilling an obligation or duty, and the other one is the state or the fact of being accountable, right? So in the first sense, responsibility is a duty, right? It is about anticipation. It is about expected conduct, right? What are we supposed to do? It's a job to be done. It's an act to be performed. So the duty might be assigned to someone by virtue of, say, belonging to an institution. For example, it is my duty to protect the records of students at university, right? That's an example of a duty. But it might also stem from a moral imperative, right? It is my duty to speak up against injustice. It is indeed my duty to intervene when I foresee impending genocide, for example, right? So that's this anticipatory, this forward-looking meaning of responsibility. But the second meaning of responsibility is retrospective, right? We look back at what's been done or what has not been done, and people need, and we are calling people to account for what they'd already done or what they failed to do. So this is the kind of responsibility that we speak of when we assign blame for disasters, when we assign blame, say, for civilian deaths, when a quote-unquote surgical strike went wrong. So what I want to say, the point I want to make with this here, is that responsibility to protect, and I really hate that acronym R2P because it makes me, there's something really inhuman about it. It makes me think of a dysfunctional robot. So I'm not going to be using it. So responsibility to protect as a framework, right, it seems to privilege this first meaning of responsibility, this responsibility as duty. And it assigns to the members of the international community, right, the responsibility to protect, that then specifically it then breaks down into these elements of the duty to prevent, to react, and to rebuild. And we can talk about those later, right? To step up when this duty calls. And there is far less attention in this framework to responsibility in the retrospective sense. And that might mean both responsibility for intervention when it goes wrong for its consequences, such as, for example, forced displacement, or for the failure to intervene, right? That accountability, that mechanism to assign culpability, to say, like, okay, these are the actors, these are the parties that really screwed up in this case, that is absent in that mechanism. So these are the deficits in the concept and the framework of responsibility to protect, and I'm hoping that we can talk more about this as we go on.
Great, thank you very much, Karolina. Okay, over to James Sweeney.
Okay, hi, I'm going to stand up so I can see roughly who I'm speaking to. Thanks for the introduction, Simon. As Simon said, I'm from the law school where I'm a professor of international law. I'm just going to take you through kind of the idea of responsibility to protect, R2P, how it connects to the law on humanitarian intervention. And so, as we've heard, the underpinning idea of responsibility to protect is that the inviolability, the integrity of a state's sovereignty is contingent on how it treats its own people. That idea is obviously clearly linked to the emergence of human rights law. The idea of responsibility to protect, when it was first proposed in 2001, as a result of thinking about what had happened with the Nato intervention in former Yugoslavia in 1999, was split into three: a responsibility to prevent, a responsibility to react, and a responsibility to rebuild. And I think that the duty or responsibilities to prevent and rebuild are obviously very, very important. And for my part, I do quite a lot of work in post-conflict and post-communist states, most recently with the UN in Kosovo this summer. But as an international lawyer, I'm sort of even more interested in what the idea of responsibility to protect says about unilateral humanitarian intervention. That's humanitarian intervention where it's not been authorised by the UN, for example. And so that's about the middle of the three responsibilities, the responsibility to react in the face of overwhelming humanitarian catastrophe. So there is a body of law about using force, let's say attacking another country. We both do international law. There isn't just one international law, there's lots. There's human rights law, there's law on conflict, there's law of the sea. These are all different areas. There's no one international legislature, therefore there's no one international law. The body of law about attacking another country is called the jus ad bellum. And there's basically two cast-iron justifications for using force against another country. One is in self-defence, if you've been the victim of an armed attack, and second is if the UN Security Council authorises it. There is no cast-iron justification for using force in the face of overwhelming humanitarian crisis. So we have to ask ourselves what happens if there is such a crisis and no authorisation from the UN Security Council is forthcoming. Just going back a sec. UN Security Council authorisation. For the first time, the UN Security Council did authorise the use of force against Libya in 2011, mentioning the protection of civilians as one of its aims. And shortly after that, the then UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon said that responsibility to protect had come of age. Okay? So the Security Council authorised the use of force. China and Russia abstained rather than vetoing the relevant resolution. So anyway, as I say, what happens if there is no authorisation from the UN Security Council? Well, the International Coalition on Intervention and State Sovereignty, the unfortunate abbreviation ISIS, the report published in 2001 actually did look at unilateral use of force, and it contemplated it being used if there was just cause, right intention, it was a last resort, proportional means were used, and there was a reasonable prospect of success. By the time of the UN World Summit in 2005, that part had been watered down and removed from the official UN adoption of the concept, taking us back to the idea that you can only intervene with permission from the Security Council. The UK, for its part, has been promoting the idea that humanitarian intervention is lawful since at least 1992. And in fact, we did it again in relation to the attacks on Syria this April, saying that we had a right as a matter of international law to attack Syria in the face of the use of chemical weapons against the civilian population. At the time, I argued it would be better for us to focus rather on the emergence of a R2P or Humanitarian Intervention doctrine to something else about preventing and punishing the use of chemical weapons. We can come back to that later. So, despite the advent, shall we say, of R2P from 2001 onwards, the idea of unilateral humanitarian intervention, I think, remains controversial in law. And it's notable that back in April, the US and France were conspicuously silent about the lawfulness of the attacks on Syria. They didn't try to claim that they were lawful. It was the UK that stuck its head above the parapet and said, we've done this and we're doing it, we think, lawfully. And one of the reasons why a lot of states don't want to sort of push the idea too far is, of course, it's open to misuse. Russia has justified its presence in Crimea using the R2P doctrine. The advantage of my approach, focusing on chemical weapons, would have prevented that happening. So, to me, the picture in law is much as it was right back in 2001. right back in, as it was in '99, before R2P was ever proposed, that humanitarian intervention is unlawful, but when it really is humanitarian intervention, is sometimes, quote unquote, legitimate, in the sense that it will not be universally condemned. Illegal but illegitimate was the finding of the independent report into the intervention regarding Kosovo. That leaves us with a question, what's the point of the law? Well, we still know what is unequivocally allowed and what is unequivocally not allowed. And we can use the language of law to structure our arguments about what we think is right and what we think is wrong. As to R2P and what that brings to the conversation, for me, it doesn't bring very much at all. So I'm in the RIP R2P camp, I'm afraid. As we get into the Q&A, I'd like to take up things about, what is the role, meaning, function, future of international law in this area. And we could also, of course, spend the rest of the afternoon talking about reform of the UN Security Council as well, which underpins a lot of the concerns here. And do remember that voting in the UN Security Council has changed at least once already. If you read the UN Charter, it says that the permanent members must vote concurrently in favour of any any resolution. We now know that a resolution can be seen as adopted where one of the P5 abstains. Okay, so there is a little window there we can see that voting rules in the UN Security Council can change. So anyway, that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you, James. And now James.
Okay, another James again. So I'll just expand on what James has already, we can't think of more original names for ourselves. I'll just expand on what James has already said. He's given you a very sort of a succinct explanation of how R2P relates to the use of force in international law. But just look at it in a wider context. Why did R2P come about? What's the pressure that led to the R2P being devised? What need did it fill? And the R2P can be seen as a reaction to a number of things that happened in the 1990s. In particular, the Kosovo intervention, which, as James said, was considered not to be lawful, but was somehow legitimate. You had states in the Security Council saying, well, we're not going to really talk about its lawfulness, but we are going to talk about its necessity. It's something that had to be done. And Kosovo itself comes from what were seen as earlier failures. The intervention in Kosovo was prompted by the very stinging failure of the UN to engage in Srebrenica, where the young Muslim men and boys of the village were captured by Serbs, and the UN peacekeeping force failed to protect those people, and they were led away and executed. And that was a really humiliation for the United Nations, that they had failed to protect a population that they had actually sent peacekeepers, a force in to protect. There was also the failure to do anything about Rwanda until it was all far too late. And the 1990s also saw an upsurge, a rebirth of international criminal law, with new international institutions, the Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, the Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, to put people on trial for the atrocities they committed. But of course, it's very easy to say that it's easy enough to put these people on trial after they've committed their acts of genocide, their crimes against humanity, rather than actually having the will to deal with those crimes when they were being committed. And the R2P comes from that particular context. The Kosovo intervention also comes from that context. States, when they were justifying the intervention, said, we were not going to have another Srebrenica here. So the R2P can be seen as a part of a failure of international law, first of all, to legally do something through the Security Council. The creation of mechanisms for bringing people to justice, but those mechanisms being seen as justice after the event. And one of the problems with those mechanisms also is that those mechanisms also rely on the Security Council, they rely on the consent of states. So if we fast forward from where we where we came from, the need that spawned the R2P, to where we are now, where we're talking about, is it RIP? Let's look at a really contemporary situation. The situation of the Rohingyas in Myanmar, the Muslim minority persecuted by the army in that country. Now, the UN has investigated it with its own commission. That commission reported that genocide was taking place in the country. So what's being done? The Security Council has been unable to act. China sees Myanmar as an ally and is prepared to use its veto to defend it. At the moment, most of the countries on the Council are pushing to have a debate on setting up an international criminal tribunal to prosecute individuals who may be responsible for the atrocities that are taking place. But again, how's that going to work out legally? If you create a tribunal or you refer the matter to the International Criminal Court, then you need to have the country as a state party. That's not going to happen. The country actually has to want to be a party to the court that will prosecute its officials. And what we've been seeing over the past couple of years is that countries have actually started peeling away from the court. The court is not actually picking up new members. It is actually losing members. As states say, well, do we really want to have to deal with these issues of either our officials being prosecuted or the fact that we would have to arrest particular people from other countries that the court wants to see prosecuted? So the other alternative is to do what they did with Rwanda or Yugoslavia and set up a tribunal. And the Security Council call all countries to assist in the prosecution. But again, the likelihood is that any such call will be vetoed by China and Russia, who will see this as protecting their interests. So what we see in international law is that we have these occasional moments where there is this sort of talk about an R2P. But it's noticeable that the R2P, once it had been proclaimed by this independent group, was quickly adopted and then tamed and to some extent neutered by the UN, who said, we fully endorse this principle, which has to operate within the framework of the UN, in particular the framework of the Security Council. And that means that the P5 have a veto over it. Now, of course, you can say, well, this is wrong. You can talk about the Security Council composition. But again, as James pointed out, and this is, again, one of the seminal cases of international law. Back after the Second World War, there's a case called Corfu Channel. And this involved someone, no one was ever identified, planting mines in the sea off the coast of Albania. And these were destroying ships. So the British said, we're just going to go in and we'll clear the mines. This was brought as a case, and one of the issues was that by going into Albanian waters to clear the mines, Britain had violated Albanian sovereignty. And one of the arguments was this justified? Was it justified to remove these mines that were a danger to ships? Could you justify those aims to support those means? And the court said, look, if you're going to claim a right of intervention, if you're going to say there's a right of intervention in international law, it's just going to be abused. Powerful countries will invoke this right to do whatever they want. And for every intervention you can see where it has saved lives, you can find other interventions where it has been justified to expand into other countries' territory. Whenever Russia, I mean, just again to pick up on James' point, when Russia intervenes in its neighbours' territory, it's always to combat genocide. Because its neighbours are always engaging in genocide whenever it wants to deploy its forces. Now, of course, you can send an international commission, and that was done in some cases, and they say, well, look, genocide has we can definitely say legally that genocide has not taken place. But by then, it's too late. The territory has been taken over and annexed. So, R2P is something that fits into a much more difficult legal position, and we can see the flaws in the law. We can see the flaws in the UN, but there are also reasons why those structures are set up the way that they are.
Thank you, James. So I'll just say a couple of little things, just from the sort of, I guess, more hands-on, more on-the-ground type of perspective, just to counter the policy and the legal structuring that we've heard from so far. I guess fundamentally, what the responsibility to protect, I'm using the full terminology, involves is a tension between the sort of respect for sovereign states, the Westphalian order that is the bedrock of international politics, but also there's more normative concerns within international politics. The concerns for individuals, communities, populations, and the desire of people involved in it is to try and strike a balance that respects both. And that, of course, is far easier to do in principle than in practice. And I think if we look at each and every instance where there has been a discussion of these types of questions, then it's striking that balance in a way that isn't abused, that isn't, or that doesn't give rise to huge genocidal acts, or indeed that can be, or that charges can be thrown at it of neo-imperialism, because that's also a serious criticism that James was touching on with regard to Russia, and the allegations that Western-driven acts of humanitarian intervention are also neo-colonial or neo-imperialist. But if we look at the devastation of Syria and Yemen, the huge numbers of deaths and the amount of destruction to people's homes, to towns and cities, it's clear that there are huge power asymmetries at play. There's a huge power imbalance that is resulting in a catastrophic loss of life, catastrophic devastation across, well, in these two cases, across in Syria and Yemen. And this is having such a profound impact on the ability of people to live the lives that they want to lead. And it seems somewhat odd that the international community, us as people, and this is putting forward the other side of the coin, that we would sit back and watch this happen. That's the serious criticism, that by doing nothing, we are in some way complicit in what's happening. We're somewhat complicit in the fact that the Assad regime has used barrel bombs, has used chemical weapons on his own population. You've got civilian populations in towns and cities across Syria that have had to withstand aerial bombardments from a regime that has military technology against a civilian population that does not, that has tried to combat rocket ships, helicopters, airplanes that are equipped with all of these devastating war equipment. And they've had to counter that by burning tyres as a means of preventing these aircraft from flying in certain areas. So they've countered the really devastating military capabilities of the Assad regime by burning rubber. Now that seems crazy, that this can take place and the world would sit back and do nothing and let it happen. So that, of course, is the counter-argument to everything that we've heard about the problems of putting this forward in practice. So I just wanted to give a slightly different side of things. We've now got about 30 minutes for Q&A, maybe 28 minutes for Q&A. James has got to get out. There's a question at the back already. So if I ask you to really speak up, please.
I'll stand. Thank you so much to the panel for your time and very informative talk. My name is Monsel Mtimpula from South Africa. I'm actually going to give multifaceted comments, so hopefully you guys will bear with me.
Please keep the comments short and keep the questions targeted.
I will do.
Thank you.
Give me 2 minutes and I promise I'll be lazy. First and foremost, I come from a country where there's no, we have a constitution where we have Article 36, which is the limitations clause, because no right is absolute. So my first problem with R2P is necessarily where do we limit that right? Secondly, is R2P a law or is it a moral conviction? Because if it's not a law, there is no basis in which you can act on it. You talk about misuse. I just want to raise a few examples you used. Libya. Libya was so called about protecting people's rights. It was actually about oil and Muammar Gaddafi giving up his nuclear weapons in 2007, even though he was promised he was not going to get attacked. In Yugoslavia, Serbia, Slobodan Milosevic, very similar to what Augusto Pinochet did in Chile, But because he was a puppet of the New World Order and Slobodan wouldn't listen, NATO invaded him illegally. It's been determined. Number 3, the Rohingyas, Aung San Suu Kyi, a so-called doyen of human rights. Everybody's been keeping quiet about that. She won a Nobel Peace Prize. She is a de facto president of Myanmar, Burma, and yet we remain silent. Number 4.
Let's leave it at 4, yeah?
Okay, cool. But all I want to say is that the United Nations Security Council should be the only authority that can authorize invasion into another nation. Otherwise, we lead to a situation where anybody at any time can think that they can invade another nation. As a future head of state, I will not allow that to happen in my country.
Thank you very much. Okay. Who would like to kick us off? Please, James.
Well, I've never addressed the future head of state.
No worries, Honourable James. You're right.
Your question, R2P, is it law? No. Is the short answer. It was an attempt to change how we talk about how the law might develop, to skew it from talking about humanitarian intervention within the Yusad Belum to a responsibility to protect. So it was an attempt to shift the agenda about how we talk about law rather than a change to the law. A quick point, you made several references to events in the world, and I think our perspectives on certain events are relatively contingent, I would say. As for the lawfulness of the attacks against former Yugoslavia by NATO, yeah, I'd say that they've not been found in any legal sense to be unlawful. The balance of opinion is that they were unlawful, and the expression used in the official report, the independent report, was illegal but illegitimate. Illegal but legitimate, as I said. And there is an argument that because the UN Security Council authorised the creation of UNMIK, the UN administration in Kosovo, after the event, that it retrospectively approved the intervention that led to that series of events. So I don't think it is clear that there has been an international conclusion in any legal sense that was unequivocally unlawful. So those are my quick responses.
Great, thank you, James. Karolina?
To this particular?
Yes.
Well, so one thing that I maybe want to pick up on is this tension between law and morality, right? Because this is something that keeps coming up. And so I'm going to propose that that as my understanding of where things stand is that we generally tend to look to law as a sort of placeholder for an agreement of what is just and moral. Because that which is just and moral is infinitely contentious and rife with contradictions and tensions depending on one's perspectives. So, this is not, we could go all the way down philosophically in terms of this debate. And so in the international arena, there's this understanding that in absence of this agreement about what is just and moral, we need to rely on the law. Is that the best? So then the question is the law that we have the best we can do? And I think those were the normative intentions behind responsibility to protect. No, the law that we have is not the best we can do. Can we make it better? So in that sense, there were those good intentions. But we all know what happens with good intentions.
Yep. Just before we move to James.
Yes, just a very, very quick two-sentence response to what Karolina was saying. It's just to say, kind of, whenever you start studying law, one of the first things you have to talk about, and it's a huge area of philosophy, is the relationship between law and morals. Broadly speaking, there's two camps. A law is a law if it's been validly created, regardless of what it says. Okay, that's legal positivism. The other view is a law is only a law, rightly so called, if it promotes moral good. So anyway, and that's called natural law. Anyway, those are the two massive camps that you get in talking about what law is, but we'll not go into there today.
Thanks, James. James.
Okay, so I think you're quite right. So the R2P is not, we're not talking about a new law. What we're looking at is how we look at the legal framework. So in particular with the Security Council, you have a situation where you might have an atrocity taking place and one member vetoes it because that country is an ally. And the question is, are we supposed to just sit on our hands and watch that atrocity take place before our eyes and do nothing about it? And of course Simon has, shown, talked about what the sort of the scale of the atrocity that is taking place in Syria, because the Security Council is unable to act on that. So the R2P is a reaction against that framework, and in essence you could say it's a call on the members of the Security Council not to put their own interests first. That where there are these four crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and ethnic cleansing, then there is a responsibility for them to act. Now, can we say it's a legal responsibility? No, the P5 members will certainly say we're not obliged to do this. But the ball is in their court that you should really be doing something about it. And if you are vetoing a resolution to deal with these atrocities because you have a military base in that country which you would like to keep your hands on, then how can you justify that? So it's, in a sense, we can see it as something intended to inform an existing legal framework rather than something that fundamentally changed it.
Okay, thanks. We'll take a couple at once, but Professor May.
Yes, I've just got one short question really, and it seems to me this responsibility to protect is of uncertain legal character, should we say that? But I think we can certainly say it has a narrative existence. And so my question to the panel is, who is the audience for this narrative existence? It's a thing we talk about. Who's the expected recipient audience?
Okay, thank you. Question here.
Great reports came to the end there. So would you say it would give rise to sort of an international vigilantism in that if you feel that you have a moral imperative to act, that you then should act?
Okay, is there one more for this round? Yes.
One of the benefits of law, as we understand it, is that it provides certainty and predictability. Now, in the context of the responsibility to protect, before attributing responsibility, I believe we should first define what humanitarian crisis would actually animate the responsibility to protect at all. And do not know if there's a definition for that, or if there's a standard that has been set that, okay, when so and so happens, then this responsibility can actually be engaged. So I don't know if that exists, because we cannot attribute, and as we can see, the Security Council is not, unanimity is not the virtue that organ of the UN is blessed with. So I don't know if the law has set any standards or definitions regarding this particular issue.
Okay, thank you. Stop this end.
Okay, I can answer that question straight away. So we're looking at four crimes, and the first one is crimes against humanity. And crimes against humanity is where there's an attack on a population, and it has the characteristics of being widespread and being systematic. So widespread is, we're talking about a large-scale attack that is organised and clearly planned. I mean, there's an element of plan and organisation in it. So we're not talking about sporadic violence, we're talking about someone planning, mobilising resources to attack a population. So that's the essential element in a crime against humanity. Genocide is you are, again, committing acts of violence or creating conditions calculated to destroy a particular group, an ethnic, religious, racial, I think national as well? National group. You're specifically targeting them with that violence or those conditions, and you are intending to destroy them in whole or in part. So that's the element of genocide. War crimes, serious violations of the laws that govern how you fight a war. So if you're not making any distinction in your use of weapons against combatants and civilians. If you're doing that in a serious way, that is a war crime. That would be a good example. If you're using prohibited weapons like nerve gas, mustard gas, that would be a war crime. So again, that's what we're talking about. And then there's ethnic cleansing, which is not a legal concept, but the idea, very similar to crimes against humanity and genocide, of removing a particular group from an area, that you cleanse a particular territory of a certain targeted group. So in all those cases, those are the 4 crimes of the R2P, and that's what is supposed to activate this obligation. So just to sort of clarify the context that we're talking about. In terms of vigilantism, that's something that international law has always faced. And if we go back even further, this has been the continuous criticism of international law is a criticism that, for example, Immanuel Kant made of international law way back in the 18th century. That international law is very good for states to start wars, but it's very bad at containing states who want to start wars. And originally, the whole idea about international law was it is essentially a vigilante system, that states could take it upon themselves to enforce an international obligation. And of course, what that meant is that very powerful states would use some sort of treaty context to intervene in other states' affairs. And during the expansion of European empires, the failure of some state to honour something in a treaty was a great invitation for colonial powers to intervene in those states. So when we look at the current regime on the use of force, the UN Charter, the whole point about the UN Charter and the reason why we have these difficult moral questions is that the UN Charter says, look, using force between states is unlawful. That's it. We don't care about the reasons, we don't care about whatever legal obligations you wanted to enforce, it's illegal. End of. If you want to use force legally, you've got to go to the Security Council. Otherwise, you've got to be attacked. Now, there's a very, very, very good reason why the UN Charter is framed in those terms. It's specifically intended to stop powerful states saying, well, we've got a very good reason to intervene. But at the same time, by discounting that, then you have the situation where you may have a very good reason to intervene. You may have a reason because you want to stop genocide or crimes against humanity or ethnic cleansing or war crimes. And the moral question is then, if you're not legally entitled to intervene, if you can't create a court to exercise jurisdiction, or a court can't exercise jurisdiction, what do? Unfortunately, there are no easy answers to these questions.
Okay, Karolina.
Right, so I'm going to pick and choose of the things I wanted to say. In response to Chris, I'm sorry I don't see you there behind the pillar. Hi. I think the question about the audience is a great one, and yeah, it's interesting to think about this. What I've always thought is that the international legal experts and policymakers who came up with this concept in the International Commission were mostly talking to each other, and that they themselves were the generator of this discourse and its main audience. But if there is a secondary audience that sort of goes beyond those elite, rarefied, and mostly white male circles, that audience are the domestic constituencies of Western states. That audience are the people like, say, the citizens of the UK who are there to witness, say, the debates in the Parliament about whether the UK should intervene or not. This discourse of responsibility, again invoking, as I said, this positive duty this image of an adult in the room, right? This is something that is quite powerful and may shift public opinion very much in the direction of, yes, we do feel interpolated here. We are the ones who bear this responsibility, therefore we have to back our politicians who are going to authorize a certain course of action. So I think that if there is an audience, that is what it is. The people who are to be protected by this responsibility are most definitely not the audience. They are not the audience, and for the most part, they have no part in fleshing out what this doctrine supposedly might mean. There is also a feminist critique, but I'll leave that for another time.
I think there's maybe an aspiration behind some of this, though. I mean, I certainly agree with the white men speaking to one another point. But I'd certainly hope that the hope behind the doctrine was that this would encourage people to behave in a certain way. It would encourage states to behave in a certain way toward their own people, remind them of the responsibilities that they have. And if you look at the pillars of the doctrine, there's the idea of having a responsibility to protect their own citizens, and that where that isn't met, then the international community has a responsibility to help the states to protect their own citizens. Mm-hmm. So I would like to think that there was maybe a broader aspiration to it.
I didn't mean to be that cynical.
I think you're probably right.
I mean, look, I'd like to think that too. I'd like to think that too, in the same way as I'd like to think that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is, in general, a good thing that, you know, we need to keep building on. And in that sense, I'm not dissing the idea of responsibility to protect, but I'm just requesting that we look very closely at how it's been constructed.
Sure. James, quick retort.
Very quick responses to your two questions. On your point about what triggers the response, the UK, as I mentioned in my talk actually, as far back as 1992, attempted to articulate a policy. And so I'm quoting now from what they said. They said there would be a right to intervene if there was a compelling and urgent situation of extreme humanitarian distress which demands immediate relief. Okay? They added to that the state is not able or willing to deal with the situation and that there's no alternative to intervention. And they spelled it out. It looks like a series of legal tests. It isn't. That's just the UK saying this is what we think we can do. Okay? Which brings me on to my very quick retort to Chris. I won't deal with the main part of your question because I think Karolina's addressed that. But you mentioned that the R2P was of uncertain provenance in law. No, I'm certain it contributes nothing. It isn't law. It's nothing. You know, it's a way of framing the debate. Its status in law is absolutely clear. It's nothing.
Great.
Could I just pick up on the point Karolina made?
Very quickly,
So
James.
Karolina, I mean, talked about the audience as being the population within a state. I think the other thing is we can also see it as something, an audience that is essentially elite, not in the sense of white men or something, but within the United Nations, within governments operating within the United Nations, as something that makes it more acceptable to follow a particular course of action that foreign offices can relate to when they're deciding how they're going to vote on a particular resolution. So I think there are different layers to the audience that the principle's aimed at.
Okay, we're rapidly running out of time, but I want to just ask for a slightly different set of perspectives. Karolina's right that the main players in the R2P were white men. And I wonder if there are any female questions. I want female questions. Either way, this is what I feared would happen. Any final question? Singular. In which case?
Can I say one thing as well before you wrap up? It's a shameless plug, actually. If you're interested in all this, I run a master's course next term on international criminal law and an undergraduate course on responding to massive human rights violations. If you've not thought about taking modules outside your department, have a think and get in touch.
Other courses are, of course, available. Okay, very quickly then, thank you all so much for coming along. We're going to be doing this a couple of times again across the remainder of the term. We've got a number of ideas for things that we're going to run, but if you have any suggestions, please do drop me a line and we'll put one on accordingly. So, thank you all, and thank you, panelists.